The first wind came low through the pines, hollow and mournful, as if the mountain itself was warning him. Elias Harrow stood at the edge of his cabin's clearing, staring into the gray void where the sky and earth had vanished into snow. He could smell the iron tang of the coming storm. Behind him, the hearth crackled faintly, and Martha's voice echoed in memory, urging him to stay. But the traps were out there, miles deep in the gulch, and the promise of pelts meant another season of survival. The world felt smaller in that moment, pressed between white silence and the restless breath of the wilderness. When he shouldered his rifle and vanished into the trees, the snow began to fall in sheets, and the storm swallowed his tracks before the sound of his footsteps died away. By nightfall, the town of Cinder Hollow lay buried under a blinding drift. Jonas Pike sat by the tavern fire, listening to the blizzard's long wail beyond the shutters. "The mountains have his scent now," he muttered, lifting his tin cup. Men around him nodded in solemn agreement, not in pity, but in understanding. They'd seen the land take better men. Outside, Reverend Wren's lantern bobbed through the storm as he made his rounds, whispering prayers into the wind. Somewhere beyond that curtain of snow, Elias Harrow was still moving, or already still. High in the pass, Elias pitched his lean-to beneath a cliff face, his body trembling from the cold that gnawed through every layer. The world was soundless save for the groan of bending trees and the hiss of snow. He thought of his brother Samuel, lost years ago to another storm like this. And for a moment, he could almost hear his voice calling through the white. A shadow flickered at the edge of the firelight, indistinct, human in shape. Elias raised his rifle, but the wind carried it away. The next morning never truly arrived, only a dim gray that felt neither day nor night. The storm had buried everything but the crown of his fire pit. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, his breath shallow. Then, through the white, a shape emerged. A man walking without sound or struggle, bareheaded, calm, Samuel. The world slowed, and the wind seemed to bow around the apparition. Elias whispered his brother's name, and the figure smiled before dissolving into snow. Days later, silence returned to the Bitterroot Valleys. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape erased of all memory. Hunters searching the trail found only Elias's broken trapline and a scattering of torn pelts. His name became a whisper in the tavern, a story told by firelight. The man who vanished into the white. Yet in the woods, something moved beneath the drifts, slow and deliberate, as if learning to breathe again. The storm had broken, but its silence lingered like a wound. Cinder Hollow lay beneath a white shroud, smoke curling from chimneys that seemed to breathe only hesitation. Martha Kane woke before dawn each morning, clearing the drifts from the cabin porch, listening for footsteps that never came. Men spoke little in those weeks. Even laughter felt like trespass. Jonas Pike wandered the edge of town each dusk, eyes scanning the timberline for signs no one expected to see. Yet when the dogs began to howl at night, their cries aimed not toward the forest, but toward the frozen river that led to Elias Harrow's traps. At the tavern, the men spoke of omens. Jonas Pike sat alone near the door, the scar on his cheek stark in the firelight. He'd found tracks that morning by the river. Long strides that ended in nothing, as if the walker had risen into the air. The Reverend said the mountain kept what it took. Martha only listened, hands folded in her lap, her thoughts caught between hope and dread. Reverend Silas Wren took to preaching in the snow outside the church, voice cracking through the cold. God speaks in tempests, he cried, and man listens only when silence follows. The congregation huddled inside, too afraid to answer. He believed Elias Harrow's disappearance was a test, that the mountains had spoken their disfavor through storm and sacrifice. Jonas watched him from a distance, eyes narrowed, remembering the last time a preacher had spoken of curses and how quickly that town had burned. That night, Martha dreamed of Elias standing by the river, his face pale and distant, his voice lost to the wind. When she awoke, she swore she heard knocking, soft, deliberate, Against the cabin wall, she lit a lamp and opened the door. The snow was undisturbed, the world still. Only the shape of a handprint marked the frost upon the window pane, large and unmistakably human. At dawn, Jonas Pike followed the frozen river north, past where Elias's traps once hung. He found torn fur, caught in a branch, and blood frozen black in the ice. But what made him stop were the prints, bare human feet, sunk deep into the crusted snow, leading upstream toward the mountains. He did not call for help. Some paths, he knew, were meant to be walked alone. 3 weeks after the blizzard, the snow had hardened into glass. The world gleamed under a sun too pale to warm it. Martha Kane was splitting kindling behind the inn when she saw him, a figure coming down the road from the timberline, slow and staggering. For a moment, she thought it was one of the hunters returning from the ridge, but when he drew near, her breath caught. It was Elias Harrow. His eyes were open but vacant, his gait too steady for a man who'd been lost to hunger and cold. The dogs began to bark, and then to whine, backing away as though scenting something that wasn't man. When they brought him inside, Elias spoke little. His skin was cold as stone, yet he did not shiver. Martha sat beside him, feeding him broth by the spoonful, watching his eyes flick to the window as though something waited outside. Jonas Pike entered, his expression wary. "You sure that's him?" he asked quiet. Martha glared, but her voice faltered when Elias turned to her and whispered her name in a tone too calm, too slow, as though he were learning the word again. By the next day, word had spread through town. Reverend Wren arrived to see the miracle with his own eyes. "No man walks from the Bitterroot alive after such a storm," he said, circling Elias like a wary wolf. Elias watched him without blinking, hands folded in his lap. When the Reverend reached to place his hand on the trapper's brow, Elias's head tilted, and his lips curved in something not quite a smile. "You left me there," he murmured, voice rasping like wind over stone. That night, Martha awoke to the creak of the cabin floorboards. Elias was gone from his bed. She followed the open door into the moonlight and saw him standing barefoot in the snow, staring at the dark ridge beyond the valley. His breath didn't cloud the air. When she called his name, he turned, slowly, dreamlike, and whispered, "He's waiting." Then he walked into the trees. Jonas Pike found Elias the next morning by the river, kneeling beside a patch of thawed ice, fingers tracing the surface like one reading a map. When Jonas called his name, Elias turned slowly and smiled, a calm, foreign expression that chilled him to the bone. "He showed me where it ends," Elias said, voice distant, almost reverent. Jonas raised his rifle, unsure whether it was fear or mercy guiding him, but before he could speak, Elias stood and walked back toward the mountains, leaving no prints in the snow. Winter thickened around Cinder Hollow like a curse that would not lift. Since Elias Harrow's return, the woods had grown unnaturally still. The snares lay empty, the streams turned murky with thawed silt, and no birds called from the trees. Martha Kane watched him from the doorway each morning as he stood motionless in the yard, eyes fixed on the mountains as though he heard voices carried in the wind. When she asked what he was listening to, he only said, "It's quieter when they're close." Her stomach turned at the sound of it. The voice of a man she knew, hollowed out and echoing from somewhere else. Jonas Pike came to the cabin one evening with the smell of wood smoke clinging to his coat. He'd found something along the ridge, a set of animal carcasses frozen mid-step, their eyes wide, their throats uncut. "That ain't nature's doing," he said grimly. Elias looked up from his chair, expression blank. "They followed too far," he said. Martha shuddered. Jonas placed his hat on the table and muttered that the mountains were keeping tally. At dusk, Reverend Silas Wren led a group of townsfolk to the cabin, Bible in one hand, lantern in the other. He demanded Elias step outside, claiming that no man returned from the storm untouched by sin. Elias complied without protest. Standing before them, he appeared calm, the lamplight reflecting in his eyes like trapped stars. "What do you think I brought back?" he asked quietly. The Reverend hesitated. "Something not of God," he said. Elias smiled. And for a heartbeat, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. That night, the animals fled the valley. Dogs tore their leashes and vanished into the woods. Horses screamed in their stalls until their hearts gave out. Martha found Elias in the barn at dawn, kneeling among the straw, eyes fixed on a place beyond sight. "They're gone," she said softly. He turned toward her with a slow, uncertain smile. "No," he replied. "They're listening." When the moon rose full, Elias left the cabin and walked into the forest without a word. Martha followed from a distance, her lantern a trembling star in the dark. She found him by the frozen creek, standing ankle-deep in water that should have broken him with cold. Around him, the ice had melted in a perfect circle. He lifted his hand and the wind stilled. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. "He is here," Elias whispered, and though no one else was visible, Martha felt the air press inward, thick and heavy, as though another presence now shared the clearing. By midwinter, fear had settled over Cinder Hollow like another kind of snow, heavy, silent, and suffocating. The people spoke of Elias Harrow in whispers now, as though his name might summon him. Fires burned longer, and doors were barred even in daylight. Martha Kane barely slept. Each night she heard footsteps pacing beyond the cabin walls, though when she looked, the snow was unbroken. Reverend Wren began preaching of the man returned without a soul, and Jonas Pike sharpened his knife without knowing why. The air itself seemed to hold a tremor, a breath not its own, as if the wilderness were learning to speak through the man who had vanished into it. Jonas Pike followed the rumors into the hills. He found animal carcasses buried in shallow snowbanks, frozen mid-flight, their bodies twisted toward the valley as if in warning. At dusk, he came upon Elias standing by the river again, motionless, staring at his reflection in the thawed water. "You still think you're a man, Harrow?" Jonas called out. Elias turned slowly, his eyes catching what little light remained. "I was," he said simply. Then the mountain took pity. In town, Reverend Silas Wren gathered his followers for prayer, but faith turned brittle under fear. "He is the herald of the storm," Wren proclaimed, his thin voice shaking the rafters. Lightning flared beyond the church windows and every candle guttered at once. In the sudden darkness, someone swore they saw a man's shadow cast against the altar, but no man stood there. Wren fell to his knees, whispering, "It's begun." That night, the wind howled through the valley with a sound like voices, hundreds of them whispering the same name. Martha fled to Jonas Pike's shack at the edge of town, her lantern swinging wildly in her grasp. Jonas listened in silence as she spoke of the voices and the footprints appearing each morning outside her cabin. When she finished, he loaded his rifle and said, "If he's calling the storm again, I'll end it this time." Martha tried to speak, but her throat closed on the words. Jonas and Martha found Elias on the ridge before dawn. The wind had died completely, the forest unnaturally still. Elias stood at the edge of the cliff, his face turned toward the rising sun, eyes closed. "It's not me they want," he said softly. "It's what was left behind." His voice carried no warmth, no human tremor, only a strange serenity. Martha stepped forward, tears freezing on her lashes. Jonas raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the light shifted, and Elias was gone, as if the air had swallowed him whole. The storm returned without warning. It came not from the west, as storms always had, but from the mountains themselves. A wall of white and thunder that rolled down into the valley like the breath of something waking. Martha Kane and Jonas Pike barely made it to the chapel before the first gale struck. The church groaned beneath the force of the wind, its timbers screaming. Reverend Wren stood before the altar, pale as bone. "He's called it back," he whispered. Outside, The snow twisted in circles that moved against the wind, shapes almost human. Somewhere, amid that roar, a voice answered. It was never gone. Elias Harrow walked at the storm's heart. Snow bent around him, never touching his skin. He moved through the trees with a calm that defied the chaos, following the faint trail of his own past, the place where Samuel had died. When he reached the frozen ridge, he dropped to his knees and placed his hand on the snow. "I'm here," he said. The storm answered with a sudden stillness, and beneath the ice, something stirred. In the chapel, Reverend Wren fell to his knees as the rafters shuddered. "He's summoning the dead," he shouted. Jonas Pike cursed under his breath and forced the door open, bracing against the wind. "No," he growled. "He's bringing it home." Without waiting for the preacher or Martha, he plunged into the storm. Martha hesitated only a moment before following, the lantern's flame clawing at the dark. Behind them, the church bell began to toll by itself, slow, steady, unbidden. They found Elias at the crest of the ridge, kneeling beside a black fissure in the ice. Jonas raised his rifle, but Martha caught his arm. Beneath them, the mountain groaned. A deep, resonant sound like breath from the earth itself. Elias turned toward them, his face serene. "He's waiting for me," he said. He never left. The snow brightened suddenly, the air alive with light and sound. Jonas fired, but the bullet vanished in midair as if the storm swallowed it whole. The storm reached its peak. Lightning flared across the mountains, and from the fissure rose a shape of swirling frost and shadow. Not man, not beast, but memory given form. Elias reached toward it, his face filled with peace. Martha screamed his name as the wind pulled him forward, the light engulfing them all. When it cleared, only she remained, half buried in snow, the ridge silent once more. The mountain had taken its due, and the world seemed to exhale. When the sun rose again, the valley was still. Snow blanketed the world in a silence so deep it pressed against the chest. Cinder Hollow lay half-buried, its chimneys broken, its windows frosted with strange spirals of ice. Martha Kane awoke alone at the base of the ridge, her breath steaming faintly. The lantern lay shattered beside her. There was no sign of Jonas Pike, nor of Elias Harrow. Only two trails led away from the mountain. One set of footprints fading into the woods, and another that simply stopped, as if their maker had taken flight. She made her way back to Cinder Hollow through a forest strangely changed. The trees were coated in glassy rime, their branches humming faintly in the wind like distant bells. No birds called. No tracks marked the snow. When she reached the outskirts, the town seemed abandoned. Doors hung open, fires long dead. Only the church bell moved, swaying softly, though no wind stirred. Martha paused beneath it and whispered, "He's gone." But the echo that came back did not sound like her own voice. Inside the chapel, Reverend Wren's Bible lay open upon the altar, the pages fused with ice. Martha knelt and touched it. Beneath her hand, the frost melted slightly, revealing a single verse. "And he was not, for God took him." She lifted her gaze to the shattered, stained glass, where morning light poured through in blue and gold. For the first time in weeks, she felt warmth. Somewhere deep in the valley, the ice cracked, like a distant exhale. Days later, Jonas Pike was found at the river's bend by a pair of hunters who'd come down from the ridge. He was frozen upright against a tree, his eyes open, watching the water. In his hand, he held Elias's old knife, its blade blackened as though burned. The men buried him there beneath the frost, saying nothing. That night, they swore the river steamed where his grave lay, and that faint echoing laughter carried through the pines. When spring came, the mountain snow melted into torrents that filled the valley once more. Martha stayed on, tending the empty inn, speaking to no one. Some nights she would walk to the ridge and stand where Elias Harrow had vanished, feeling the cold wind curl around her hair. She never said what she saw there, only that the wind carried two voices now, one human, one not, and that somewhere beyond the reach of thaw and season, Elias still walked among the whiteness, neither holy man nor ghost.